Okay, so this is our ongoing reading of Simon Don's Individuation in the Light of Notions of Form and Information. We're on part 2 of the book on vital individuation, which we started last week. And so we're still on chapter 1, section 1, subsection 1 of that part. We saw a little bit about the way that he introduces vital individuation as a slowing down of physical individuation. So it's not that there's physical individuation and then vital individuation is something sort of on top of it or afterwards, but the vital individuation intervenes as a sort of slowing down of physical individuation. So rather than having, in the case of physical individuation, you have an event of taking on form, which sort of takes place instantaneously or at one particular moment, and then afterwards you have the individuated being, which just sort of subsists in that individuated state. Whereas in the case of vital individuation, that individuating process is extended throughout the lifespan of the living being. So it doesn't ever fully individuate. It always keeps that pre-individual element and that capacity to undergo further individuations. So it's in that sense that the vital individuation is a slowing down of physical individuation. And then we had this weird remark about materialism, that he says that the doctrine that he's presenting is not a materialism. And then he says because it supposes a sort of continuity between physical reality and biological forms without a distinction between classes and genera. So we'll see today a little bit more on this notion of materialism and what he seems to take that to mean. Yeah, I don't think it fully elucidates the earlier remark, but yeah, it's something we can come back to. But yeah, we'll pick up from page 169 from where we ended last time. So I think we're at the first full paragraph, or the paragraph beginning on 169, about halfway down the page. So I'll start reading and we'll go from there. Such are the properties that can be studied in order to characterize the living being rather than the specific form, which does not allow us to go back down to the individual, since this form has been obtained by abstraction and therefore by reduction. This kind of research supposes that we consider legitimate the usage in biology of a paradigm taken from the domain of the physical sciences, and particularly from the processes of morphogenesis that occur within this domain. In this sense, it is necessary to suppose that the elementary levels of the biological order contain an organization of the same order as the one that the most perfectly individuated physical systems contain. For example, those that generate crystals or the large metastable molecules of organic chemistry. Indeed, such a research hypothesis can seem quite overwhelming. Custom, in fact, prompts us to think that living beings cannot result from physical beings, since they are superior to the latter due to their organization. Nevertheless, this very attitude is a consequence of an initial postulate according to which inert nature cannot contain a high level of organization. If, on the contrary, we posited right from the beginning that the physical world is already highly organized, we wouldn't be capable of committing this basic error that results from a devaluation of inert matter. In materialism, there is a doctrine of values that supposes an implicit spiritualism. Matter is given as less richly organized than the living being, and materialism seeks to show that the superior can emerge from the inferior. It constitutes an attempt at the reduction of the complex to the simple. But if from the start it is established that matter contains constitutes systems provided with a very high level of organization, then we cannot so easily hierarchize life and matter. Perhaps it would be necessary to suppose that the organization is conserved, but is transformed in the passage from matter to life. If this were the case, then we would have to suppose that science will never be complete, since this science is a relation of beings that by definition have the same degree of organization. A material system and an organized living being attempting to think this system by means of science. If it were true that organization is neither lost nor created, we would conclude that organization cannot but be transformed. So if it were true that organization is neither lost nor created, we would conclude that organization cannot but be transformed. A type of direct relation between the object and the subject manifests in this affirmation, for the relation between thought and the real becomes a relation between two organized reals that can be analogically linked by their internal structure. However, even if organization is conserved, it is untrue to say that death is nothing. There will be death, evolution, and involution, and the theory of the rapport between matter and life must be able to account for these transformations. According to this theory, there would be a determined level of organization in each system, and these same levels would be found in a physical being and in a living being. This is why it would be necessary to suppose that when beings like an animal are composed of several superposed ranks of relays and systems of integration, there is no single organization within them that would have any exterior cause, origin, or equivalent. Since the level of organization belonging to each system is limited, it can be thought that if a being seems to possess a high level of organization, this is because it actually integrates already informed and integrated elements, and because its own integrative task is quite limited. Its individuality would then be reduced to a fairly restrained organization, and the word nature, which is applied to what in the individual is not the product of its activity, would have a very important meaning, since each individual would be indebted to its nature for the rich organization that it seems to possess on its own. It could then be supposed that the external richness of the relation to the milieu is equal to the internal richness of organization contained in an individual. Oh no, the French says the same thing. So yeah, that's right. He's developing further this theme of or this doctrine that living beings or vital individuation constitute a certain form of organization compared to physical individuation or physical beings. So there's not something in addition to physical individuation. There's a reorganization or a restructuring of a physical being that makes it into a living being. So in a living being, some of the organization, or there's this presupposition of the already organized matter, or the physical being is already highly organized, and then vital individuation is just a transformation of that organization. It's not a higher degree of organization. He comes back to this idea about materialism, about this doctrine not being a materialism. It's a bit of a strange characterization of materialism, because he suggests that, or he states that materialism presupposes that matter is less richly organized than the living being, so that there's this hierarchy between the living and the non-living, and he's taking that as a characteristic of materialism. I think that is kind of a strange characterization of materialism. I think maybe a more standard conception of materialism would be just to deny that there is something like a hierarchy between the living and the non-living, rather than saying that there's this hierarchy and then the superior can emerge from the inferior, which is how he characterizes it. I'm not sure who exactly he has in mind when he talks about materialism. It's a strange characterization of materialism. Right, and then Angus asked in the chat, is he rejecting the idea that there's a transformation between living and non-living? I don't think he's rejecting the idea of any sort of transformation. What he's rejecting is the idea that there's an increase in organization, that non-living matter is unorganized and then undergoes organization, or undergoes a higher degree of organization in the living being. He's stating here that the transformation from non-living to living is a reorganization, but it's not an increase in the degree of organization. It's the same to the extent that there's something like a degree of organization. It would be the same degree. Right, and then there's this sort of a side, but an interesting reflection on science, what this doctrine means for science, so that if we accept that organization can only be preserved, it can only be transformed, but there's never something like a disappearance or an appearance of organization. If we accept that doctrine, then we'd also have to accept the necessary incompleteness of science. So science can never be completed because the knowing subject that uses science to think the world would have the same degree of organization as the worlds that it's trying to think, so that there's no way to sort of capture the whole organization of the physical world within the living world, because they have the same degree of organization. So yeah, that's an interesting reflection, I think, on the implication for science of assuming that the living and the non-living have the same degree of organization. And yeah, and then so the last paragraph here, he introduces the idea that the high degree of organization that we find in, say, an animal, in which we have a whole hierarchy of organs, which are composed of cells, which are composed of organelles, and they all sort of interlock and work together in appropriate ways. So this organization is presupposes or is built on the a pre-existing organization of matter, of a physical entity, and so it has this quality of being highly organized because it's integrating things that are already organized, rather than having to perform the whole organization on its own. And so this pre-existing organized aspect of the living being is what he calls its nature. So nature here meaning something that is not the product of its own activity. So associated with each individual, there's something that is not the product of its own activity, is sort of inherited by the individual. And in this case, that nature is already organized, and so it only has to integrate those pre-existing organizations into its own organization. Yeah, and so Alyosha posted in the chat the footnote 3 in this section, which points to what Simondon sees as what is missing from materialism, is that it doesn't account for information, or doesn't take information into account. He specifies this as meaning, or as saying that this is not true if we take the physical worlds to contain systems in which there are potential energies and relations or supports for information. So this quality of having potential energies and information in his specific sense of that term, he takes that as being something that materialism doesn't account for, and as being as sort of making materialism not necessary or not relevant anymore. Yeah, so again, it's sort of a particular understanding of materialism, I think, but I'm not sure who exactly he has in mind. Okay, so we can go on to the next page or so if someone else would like to read.
I can read. Internal integration is made possible by the quantum nature of the relation between interior and exterior milieus and the individual as a definite structure. The individual's characteristic relays and integrators could not function without this quantum regime of exchanges. The group exists as an integrator and differentiator relative to these sub-individuals. The relation between the singular being and the group is the same as between the individual and sub-individuals. In this sense, we could say that there is a homogeneity of relation between the different hierarchical scales of the same individual, and similarly between the group and the individual. The total level of information is then measured by the number of stages of integration and differentiation, as well as by the relation between integration and differentiation, which can be called transduction, in the living being. In the biological being, transduction is not direct but indirect according to a twofold ascending and descending chain. Along each of these chains, transduction is what allows for signals of information to pass. But this passage, instead of being a simple conveyance of information, is integration or differentiation. and is produced by a preliminary labor due to which the final transduction is made possible. Whereas in the physical domain, this transduction exists in a system as a weak or elevated internal resonance. If integration and differentiation alone were real, life would not exist, for there would also have to be resonance. But then it would be a question of a particular type of resonance that allows for a preliminary activity which requires an elaboration. If we utilize psychological terms to describe these activities, we will see that integration corresponds to the usage of representation and differentiation. Integration responds to the usage of representation, and differentiation responds to the usage of activity, which distributes in time energies acquired progressively and kept in reserve, whereas representation preserves the information acquired through abrupt leaps according to the circumstances in such a way as to create a continuum. Ultimately, transduction is carried out by affectivity and by all the systems that play the role in the organism of transductors on various levels. The individual would therefore always be a system of transduction, but while this transduction is direct and on a single level in the physical system, it is indirect and hierarchized in the living being. It would be false to think that there is transduction only in a physical system, for there is also an integration and a differentiation, but they are situated on the very limits of the individual and only detectable when it grows. This integration and differentiation at the limits are found in the living individual, but then they characterize its relation to the group or to the world, and they can be relatively independent from the differentiation and integration that take place within the living individual. Such an assertion makes it impossible to understand how these two groups of integration and differentiation are connected. Those that act on the exterior cause structural changes of the ensemble in which they occur, changes which are comparable to those of a corpuscle that absorbs or emits energy in a quantum way by passing from a more excited state to a less excited state, or vice versa. Perhaps the relation between the two types of processes is the basis of this variation in the individual's levels, accompanied by a structural change that is the internal correlative of an exchange of information or energy with the outside. Indeed, let's note that effort doesn't just have motor aspects, but also has affective and representative aspects. The quantum characteristic of effort, spanning both a continuity and a discontinuity, very clearly represents this integration and this differentiation and the mutual relations of an interior grouping to an exterior grouping.
Yeah, so this is a pretty dense section. There's a lot that's not super clear to start with. So let's sort of go through it in order and see what we can make of it. So he's setting out, he starts with talking about integration. So this is what he mentioned previously about how integration of how a living being integrates the previously organized physical organization. So there's this internal organization that is characteristic of a living being, and then there's also the relationship of the individual as an element of a group. So he mentioned this a little bit earlier in what we read last week, I think, where he talks about how the living individual, from a certain perspective, can be seen as just a member of a group, like a species or the class or whatever level of the hierarchy you select, and you can treat the species or the class as the individual, and then the member of the species would just be a portion of or an element of that individual. So there's this relation. So in each case, we have this relationship of integration and differentiation, where both aspects are equally important or equally prevalent within this individual. So within the singular individual, there's this integration and differentiation of organization, and then within the species or the group, there's likewise an integration and differentiation. And so there's these two aspects that constitute the organization of a living being, whether at the level of what we would call an individual versus whether what we would call a group. And then, so yeah, there's this criterion for the level of information or the hierarchy of degrees of individuation, which is the number of stages of integration and differentiation, and then the relation between them, which is transduction. So we've seen this notion of transduction come up in a number of different contexts, but here it's playing the role of relating the integration and the differentiation to each other. Yeah, so he also, in footnote 4 that Alyosha has posted in the chat, there's this, he ties the notion of transduction back to the notion of internal resonance or resonance, and he also calls this active analogy. And we can think back to the introduction when he says that transductive thinking is what is valid about analogical thinking. So it captures the what is valid in analogical thinking rather than what is invalid. Yeah, that active analogy. So the couplage of non-symmetrical terms. So here we can think back to this notion that we saw in the chapter on, or the part on physical individuation, that any true relation, so a relation that has the status of being, is always between a continuous term and a discontinuous term. So that's what makes the relation asymmetrical or non-symmetrical, and that's what gives it the capacity to undergo individuation. Right. So transduction here again is the relation between integration and differentiation, and so these two sides, the integration and differentiation, are depicted as chains in the organization of the living being. So an ascending and a descending chain. So integration would be the ascending chain, and then differentiation would be the descending chain. And transduction is the relation between these two chains, but it's also, as he puts it here, this transduction is what allows for signals of information to pass along those chains. So it's only because there's this relation between the two chains that there's something like a signal that can pass along the chain of integration and differentiation. Yeah, so the definition of integration and differentiation, he doesn't give a sort of a explicit definition of those two terms, but I think we can understand them. We can understand them as the integration is this incorporation of pre-existing organization that he specified a couple paragraphs earlier. So the living being takes something that is already organized and transforms its organization. So that's the integration side. And then the differentiation side would be, I think, what we see a little bit later, if I remember correctly, the way that a living individual or a living being is capable of selecting ends in the way that a machine is not capable for Simondon. He contrasts an automaton with a living being a little bit later. I'm not sure if we're going to get to that today. but what's characterizes a living being as opposed to an automaton is that the living being is capable of selecting ends and not just adapting towards existing like pre-given ends. And so that I think differentiation, we can think of it along those lines. The living being is capable of selecting various ends that it works towards, that it organizes itself towards. So that's the sort of complementary aspect to the integration side, which is the incorporation of existing organization. Yeah, so where were we in the text here? Right, so then he introduces the psychological terms, which is pretty weird because there's a whole section on psychic individuation, or a whole part of the book on psychic individuation that we haven't gotten to yet. So he's just starting the part on vital individuation, and then he immediately skips forward to what he's going to talk about in vital individuation. So yeah, it's pretty strange. But then he gives us these psychological equivalents for the different aspects of vital organization that he's already set out. So we have these three aspects: the integration, differentiation, and transduction, which is the relation between the two. And then each of those will correspond to a particular psychological function. So we have integration corresponds to representation, differentiation corresponds to activity, and then transduction corresponds to affectivity. Yeah, so this we can point this, we can connect it back to that sentence on the previous page when he talks about the way that the information contained in a living being can be measured by the number of stages of integration and differentiation, as well as the relation between the two, and then that relation is transduction. Yeah, so we can sort of point back towards that that passage. And so I think it helps to, like, these psychological terms are confusing in one sense because we don't really know why he's introducing psychology or the level of psychic individuation when we're still at the level of vital individuation. But they also, I think, help to sort of visualize or sort of picture what's going on, because we can have something like a mental image of what representation and activity and affectivity mean, in a way that integration and differentiation and transduction don't really provide that same mental picture. So yeah, I think that can help in another respect, even if it's confusing in the other in the first respect. Yeah, so information here. So he's talking about the quantity of information. So a measure of information, and he defines this measurement as the number of stages of integration and differentiation that are incorporated into that living being. So it's a definition of how we're supposed to understand the quantity of information in this context. I think, though, it's not. I don't think it's intended, and I don't think it can be applied as like a quantitative measurement. Like, these stages of integration and differentiation are not things you can sort of observe and count in the way that you could count, like, I don't know, the number of hairs on the back of a caterpillar or something like that. Uh, so you can't just sort of see these stages and count them and then compute what the information content is. It's meant to be conceptually definitional, rather than like a practical recipe for calculating what this quantity of information is. And then there's this bit which again is pretty obscure or dense, where he says that well, first of all, he says that the individual is always a system of transduction, but and so that covers both the physical individual and the vital individual. But the difference is that in the physical system, transduction is direct and on a single level, as he puts it, whereas in the vital individual, it's indirect and hierarchized. So it has these layers or levels of pre-existing organization in a way that the physical system doesn't. So that is relatively straightforward, but the next bit is the one that I have trouble with. So he says that it would be false to think that only transduction exists in a physical system, for there is also an integration and a differentiation, but they are situated on the very limits of the individual and only detectable when it grows. I'm not really sure what he wants to characterize as integration and differentiation in the physical system, because he had described the formation of the crystal as a transductive process, in the sense that it's a structuration of a previously unstructured field, that progresses gradually across that field. But I don't know what the differentiation and integration is supposed to be in the case of the physical system. And he says that we should be able to find it there. We should be able to find those two functions in the physical system as well. But yeah, and these two functions are only found at the limits of the crystal, or the physical individual more generally. We can sort of bracket that bit, that obscurity of what the integration and differentiation are meant to be in the case of the physical individual. We can put that aside for the moment. And then the next bit is he states that this same type of integration and differentiation that occurs at the limits is also found in the living being, but in this case, those two functions characterize the relation of that living being to the group or to the external world. So there's within the living being, there's the internal differentiation and integration, and then there's also this differentiation and integration at the limits, which is related to that living being's relation to the group and to the external world. But we have to find a way to to grasp the relation between these two forms of integration and differentiation. So the internal one and the external one. So we have to understand what the relation is between those two. And so he suggests that the ones that act on the exterior, so the external forms of integration and differentiation, the ones that act on the limit, they're comparable to the way that a particle will absorb or emit energy in a quantum way, so in a discontinuous way, by passing to a more excited state or a less excited state. And so there's a relationship between the internal operations of structuration, the changes of structure within the organism, and the effect of that living being on the group and the external world. So there's always a sort of complementary structural change, as well as an exchange of information or energy with the outside world. So those two sides are coordinated with each other. And then the last little bit here is again bringing up these psychological equivalents to the three functions that he's introduced as being the characteristics of vital individuation. But then this indeed here sort of suggests that this is meant to be an illustration or a consequence of what came before, but the connection is not obvious to me. I'm not sure exactly what the connection is here, but he goes on to say that effort as a state of a living being, it doesn't just have motor aspects, so it's not just characteristic of the differentiation function, but it also has affective and representative aspects. So it also has this transductive aspect to it, and the integrative aspect. So all three functions are present in the case of effort. And then, so he describes it as this quantum characteristic. So the fact that effort has both continuous and discontinuous aspects, or it sort of bridges between continuity and discontinuity. And this is supposed to explain the connection or the relation between the interior forms, or the interior realization of the three functions, and the exterior relation of those three functions. So how those two are joined together is through this quantum characteristic of effort. But again, that's not entirely clear to me or obvious what that connection is supposed to mean.
Well, I just wanted to ask about this bit about the limit thing, because I thought that was a really interesting distinction. But I was reading, and I don't want to jump ahead, if this is in another text or if it's in his book more on psychosocial individuation and all that. But Combs is kind of bringing up this interesting idea of Simon Dong trying not to fall into another notion of substance with mind that ends up in something like the unconscious or consciousness, using affectivity and all this stuff. But she brings up this notion of the subconscious that I thought might be helpful. And I just looking at that section, talking about the limit, like it's when he says that it's also found in the living individual, but it characterizes its relation to the group and the world, but while still being relatively independent from the differentiation and integration taking place within the living individual. Is it at all right to think of that as, so if he's saying that there's a kind of differentiation and integration that happens within a living individual that is some kind of interiority to it, would that correspond to sort of the somatic and vital processes that he's been describing? Because I think in these pages he'll come up with this distinction, right? There's somatic and psychic. Because if that's the case, then it would almost make sense to me that while not completely interior in the same way as those kinds of basic vital processes, that, on page, I think it was 171, he described thought and the real having a kind of internal structure rather than thinking of them as, external things being put into relation. So what I'm trying to piece all together here, if we allow for a notion of something like a subconscious that isn't a substance, that is a sort of a process of resolving problematics like we've seen with Simon Don, that is its limit with the social, that is the part of living being that is the, you could say like the internal or one part of the internal structure that is the thought and the real, then that could be sort of that corresponds to the psyche aspect, and then this other, I don't know if I'm making sense here, but in my head, the use of something like the subconscious rather than the unconscious might help situate what he's talking about. I don't know if that's at all helpful or off.
Yeah, I'm not really sure whether that. I'd have to look at what Holmes says about this distinction between the subconscious and the unconscious. If I remember correctly, I think Simondon doesn't really make use of the notion of the unconscious in the part on psychic individuation, but I don't think he explicitly refers to the subconscious either. But yeah, I think to the extent that something like the unconscious would have an existing structure of individuation or something like that, I think that's what he would oppose, and he would want to view the subconscious or unconscious, whichever term we want to use. He would view that as being something like the associated pre-individual aspect of the psychic individual. So every psychic individual would have this associated pre-individual aspect as sort of part of the remnant of that process of individuation. So yeah, I'm not sure if that really connects with your suggestion, but yeah, that's
I guess even if you throw away the term subconscious, I guess my question is, what is a limit in the living individual that is not something that takes place within it? Because that's what it sounds like what he says in that sentence, that it is independent from this kind of, transduction that takes place within the living individual. It feels like a little bit of just linguistic vagueness. Maybe we also bracket this, but it's like he's trying to define there's a kind of interiority here that happens, but there's, if you're talking about the psyche, I mean, I don't think we can use the crystal's limit as the same example in the living being, because I don't think he's talking about the body or your skin or something, or even just sensations or perception itself as that kind of limit which connects the psychic individual with the group or to the world. So that's why it felt like there needs to be some kind of liminal, whatever it's called or however he describes it, something that is sort of straddling interior and exterior, perhaps in the milieu kind of thing, that corresponds to what he's saying.
Yeah, this bit on the limits is another not 100% clear section on or passage in this bit that we just read. So a couple pages earlier, he compared the way that in the case of the vital individual, there are spatial and temporal limits in the sense that the living individual has to have a determined size range and it has a determined lifespan in a way that the physical individual, so the crystal, for example, does not have determined limits. So the crystal just keeps on growing as long as it's surrounded by the appropriate medium, and then it will just continue to grow. There's no intrinsic limits to the size of that crystal. But then, so yeah, and then he states that the correspondent to the physical individual in the case of living beings is not the living individual themselves or the singular living being, but the group, because the group of living beings doesn't have an intrinsic limit in the way that the individual does. So you can think of like a beehive or a termite colony or something like that, which can be made up of any number of individuals and in principle can continue to grow in size indefinitely. And so there's some sort of correspondence between the way that the crystal has this transduction happening at the limit of its formation, so that it's undergoing individuation at that limit. There's some sort of correspondence between that and the way that the group is capable of expanding indefinitely. Somehow, the what we call the individual, what we recognize as the living individual, the member of the group, is inserted into that group in some way. So there's some sort of the differentiation and integration are somehow happening across the boundary between the living individual and the group in which it's inserted, and this this boundary has to be somehow connected to that growth analog in the case of the group. But yeah, it's still not very clear to me what exactly that's supposed to look like. That's just as far as I can get with those portions of the text. Yeah, I think some of these points will come up again as we continue reading, so we can come back to these questions as we go along. So yeah, would someone else like to read from 172, The Problem of Individuation?
I can go. The problem of individuation would be resolved if we knew what information is in its rapport with other fundamental physical quantities, like the quantity of matter or the quantity of energy. The homeostasis of the living being does not exist in the purely physical being, because homeostasis is related to external conditions of transduction, due to which the being utilizes the equivalents in external conditions as safeguards for its own stability and its internal transduction. In physics, heterogeneous transductive characteristics only appear in the margins of this physical reality. On the contrary, interiority and exteriority are everywhere in the living being. The nervous system and the interior milieu guarantee that this interiority is in contact on all sides with a relative exteriority. The equilibrium between integration and differentiation is what characterizes life, but homeostasis is not full vital stability. The quantum nature of discontinuous action will be opposed to the continuous nature of the constructive knowledge of synthesis in order to constitute this mixture of the continuous and discontinuous that is manifested in the regulative qualities which serve as a rapport between integration and differentiation. Qualities appear in the reactivity through which the living being evaluates its own action. However, these qualities do not allow us to reduce this rapport to a simple consciousness of the discrepancy between the end and the result, and thus to a simple signal. This is what the automaton lacks in order to be a living being. The automaton can only adapt in a manner convergent with a set of conditions by increasingly reducing the gap that exists between its action and its predetermined end. But it does not prevent and does not discover ends during its action, for it does not carry out any veritable transduction, since transduction is the expansion of an initially very restricted domain that increasingly takes on size and structure. Biological species are endowed with this capacity of transduction, due to which they can indefinitely expand. Crystals are also endowed with this capacity to indefinitely expand, but whereas the crystal has its whole power of growing localized on its limit, this power in the species has fallen to an ensemble of individuals that grow for themselves, from the interior as well as the exterior, and that are limited in time and space, but reproduce and are unlimited due to their capacities to reproduce. The most conspicuous biological transduction is thus essentially the fact that each individual reproduces analogs. The species advances in time like a physico-chemical modification that would proceed by degrees with a marginally weak recovery of generations, i.e., like active molecular levels on the edge of a crystal undergoing formation. In some cases, an edifice comparable to that of the crystal is left behind by the generations that come after it. Furthermore, the growth of the living individual is an ongoing and localized type of transduction that has no analog in physics. A particular individuality combines with speciated individuality.
Yeah, so I think I misremembered, and this passage we just read is what I was thinking of a little while earlier. So when he talks about the relationship between the species and the member of the species, and comparing the species or the group in its capacity to expand indefinitely with the crystal. I think this is the passage I was thinking of. Also, there's the one point of translation. There's right. So the sentence beginning, "This is what the automaton lacks." Then a couple semicolons in, it says in the translation, "But it does not prevent and does not discover ends during its action." In French, it says, "But it does not invent, not prevent." So the automaton does not invent and it does not discover ends during its action, which I think makes more sense than prevent in this context. Yeah, so, and this is again something that I mentioned a little while earlier, the contrast between the automaton and the living being. So in the case of the automaton, it can adapt to an end that's pre-given. So it can, so I think he's thinking of things like the homeostat that was it Ashby, I think, who came up with it. Anyway, it's a machine that's capable of maintaining a certain state, and then if it's pushed out of that state, it returns to that state. But that state that it returns to is sort of built into that machine, so it's always going to return to that given state. Whereas in the case of living beings, Simondon says that they're capable of not just adapting to maintain a certain given state, but of selecting something like ends, or selecting what state they're going to maintain. So he describes this as a sort of invention or a discovery, and so this is what distinguishes the living being from the automaton, is precisely that capacity to discover or to invent a new end to adapt to, rather than just accommodating to an existing end. And yeah, I think this is maybe a more controversial statement today than it was in 1960 or so when he's writing this, given the state of computing technology at that time and today. Yeah, so you would have to make a stronger case for it than just sort of stating it the way he does, that automata are not capable of selecting ends, but or conversely, you'd have to make the case that living beings are not just automata in the sense that he sets out here, that there is something, because I think a lot of the advances in computing technology since Simondon's time have showed that you can simulate something like invention or discovery using something like an automaton in the sense that he's describing. So something that it just seeks a certain predetermined end. But if you have a machine set up in the right sort of configuration, or it has the degree of complexity required, then it can give what appears to be invention or discovery. And so that raises the possibility that what we think of as invention or discovery is ultimately just something like this automaton type process, but in a very complicated way. So those two possibilities, I think, are ones that are still open today in a way that they weren't in 1960. Maybe to make that more concrete, we can think of, for example, the computer programs that play chess or Go, that are now capable of beating the best human players. They still rely on a lot of brute force, just calculating all the possibilities, like what's the value of move A versus move B. There's a lot of pretty basic calculations, just that they're doing many millions of them every second, and so they're able to evaluate many more positions than a human can. But then in those games that they play against human players, their human opponents have described the behavior of these systems as being inventive and creative and so on. So through the iteration of very low level adaptive type processes that are sort of set to pre-given ends through the iteration of those processes many millions of times per second. You can create behavior that looks from the outside, at least, as if it's creative and inventive. And so there's that, I think, raises the possibility that you can, in some sense, reduce creative or inventive behavior to just some complicated organization of very simple automaton-like structures. So in this passage, there's also there's this notion of qualities that he introduces sort of out of nowhere, where he says that, so this is on page 172, about 3/4 of the way down. So he says, qualities appear in the reactivity through which the living being evaluates its own action. However, these qualities do not allow us to reduce this rapport to a simple consciousness of the discrepancy between the end and the result, and thus to a simple signal. So this notion of qualities is not really defined or introduced explicitly. He just sort of uses it without telling us what he's doing with it. But so it's clear here what he's rejecting, which is an account of sensation or the qualitative aspect of perception, which would identify qualities with a signal of a discrepancy between the goal and the result of an action. And so this is like a sort of cybernetic account of perception, where your cybernetic system, your robot or homeostat or whatever would have an end state that it's seeking to create or to bring about, and then it would take in information from its environment and evaluate the discrepancy between the end state and the current state, and then it would act in such a way as to reduce that discrepancy until it is below the detectable limit, or the whatever predefined limit of discrepancy is given. That sort of cybernetic account of a quality is what he's rejecting here. But what he's proposing positively is a little less obvious. But so in rejecting that cybernetic account, he's not sort of throwing the whole thing out, because I think for him that does represent an aspect of what appears in the qualitative or in qualities. So qualities appear in relation to the living being evaluating its own action. So there's still that aspect of sort of self-monitoring is part of what makes up a quality. I think it's the bit about ends being pre-given again that he's objecting to. So in the quality or in qualitative experience, there's not just something like a measurement or a signal of the discrepancy between the end state and the current state, but at the same time, there's something like an invention of an end state or a discovery of an end state as something to be reached or to be brought about. So there's at the same time, so we have this measurement of discrepancy, or the signal aspect is only ever given at the same time as the other aspect, the invention or creation aspect. One is not possible without the other in living beings, and it's precisely because in automata they don't have that second aspect. That's precisely what differentiates them from living beings. They don't have that invention or discovery capacity. And then we have the bit that we already talked about this indefinite expansion capacity, this characterization of biological transduction as being as coming through as being brought about through reproduction. So the way that in the same way that the crystal grows by accretion at its limits, the species grows, or the group in general grows through the generation of new individuals in reproduction. Yeah, so that's the sort of correlation or analogy there between the crystal growth and the growth of the species. And then he also points out that in certain cases, so in certain living beings, there's something like a crystal that is left behind by the living being. And I think he's thinking of corals as an example of this. So corals form this reef structure that is left behind after the one individual dies, and then further individuals grow onto that same structure. Is that something like culture? I think he would want to. I'm just trying to remember what he says about this in the bit on psychic individuation and the trans individual. I think he would want to. I think he'd want to characterize culture in a different way, because it has something like a reactivation in every generation. It's not just something that's inherited in the way that one generation of corals inherits the reef created by the previous one. Culture has to be sort of reinvented in every generation. Like you can't just sort of passively receive culture. You have to actively reinvent it, in a sense, in order for it to even exist. Like in the case of a language, if no one speaks a language, then we call it a dead language. It's not an existing language anymore. And likewise for other forms of culture. So yeah, I think in that sense, this is not exactly the same type of inheritance that's at work. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next bit, although there's still a lot that is not 100% clear in the previous passage. So we're on 173, the first full paragraph. Life would therefore be conditioned by the recurrence of causality due to which a process of integration and a process of differentiation can receive a coupling while remaining distinct in their structures. Thus, life is not a distinct substance of matter. It supposes processes of integration and differentiation that cannot in any way be given by something other than physical structures. In this sense, there would be a profound triality of the living being, through which we would find in it two complementary activities and a third activity that carries out the integration of the preceding as well as their differentiation via the activity of causal recurrence. Indeed, recurrence does not add a third relation to the preceding, but the qualification that it authorizes and constitutes provides a relation between activities that could not have any other commonality. The basis of unity and affective identity is therefore in the affective polarity, due to which there can be a relation of the one and the multiple, of differentiation and integration. What the qualification constitutes is the relation of two dynamisms. It is already this relation on the lowest level, and it remains on the level of the superior affectivity of human feelings. Beginning with pain and pleasure, understood in their concretely organic nature, relation manifests as a closure of the reflex arc, which is always qualified and oriented. Higher up in sensible quality, a similar polarity, which is integrated as a global and particularly dense constellation, characterizes the acquired personality and allows for it to be recognized. When a subject wants to express its internal states, what it resorts to is this relation through the intermediary of affectivity, which is the principle of art and of all communication. In order to characterize an exterior thing that cannot be shown, it is through affectivity that we pass from the continuous totality of knowledge to the singular unity of the object to be evoked. And this is possible because affectivity is present and available to institute the relation. Each association of ideas passes through this affective relation. Thus, there are two possible types of utilization of relation already constituted by going from the unity of knowledge to the plurality of action, or from the multiplicity of action to the unity of knowledge. These two complementary paths are joined together in certain symbolisms, like poetic symbolism, and due to this double relation, poetic symbolism can become self-enclosed in aesthetic recurrence, which does not benefit the integration of the entire subject, since it is in fact already virtually contained in the premises of the symbol object to be contemplated, and utilized as a mixture of activity and knowledge. The anatomo-physiological study of vital processes reveals the distinction between the motor and the receptor organs, at least in the arrangement of the cortical areas and in the functioning of the brain. But we also know that the brain is not just composed of areas of projection. A large part of the frontal lobes takes part in the association between the receptor and motor areas. The neurosurgical practice of lobotomy, which consists in dampening the recurrence of causality, linking integration and differentiation, deeply modifies the subject's affectivity, whereas in principle, this lobotomical intervention perfectly leaves intact the center or centers of affectivity situated in the region of the pituitary stalk, i.e., in regions quite different from those that constitute the neocortex. According to this hypothesis, it would be necessary to distinguish between instantaneous affectivity, which is perhaps indeed localizable in the region of the pituitary stalk, and relational affectivity, which concerns what is produced by the integrative activity and differentiated activity, which could be called affective activity since it characterizes the individual in its singular life and not in its relation to the species. The region of the archicortex would then concern more so the regulation of drives than the regulation of elaborated affectivity. It would manifest in the relation between the subject's tendencies and the qualities that it discovers in the milieu, more so than in the conscious elaboration of this transduction, characterized by the activity of the neocortex, which is the affectivity of the individual qua individual. So yeah, there's a lot here. Again, the Nick Young question mark meme is appropriate. So yeah, there's this recurrence of causality is what he had previously talked about with the way that a living being is capable of monitoring its own action and inventing an end for action. In this recurrence, there's a sort of unity of these three activities or three functions of the living being. So the integration, differentiation, and transduction, which is the coupling between the previous two. Yeah, so there's this triality or threefoldness to the living being in the sense that it unifies these two complementary activities of integration and differentiation, and then the third activity of transduction acts as a sort of integration and differentiation of the previous two activities. So it sort of repeats itself within transduction. And then he goes on to suggest or to state that recurrence is not a third relation in addition to integration and differentiation. It's the qualification or the sort of realization of integration and differentiation as qualities. So yeah, there's this unity between the three activities, which takes the form of affective polarity. So in the way that affects are polarized and so the paradigmatic example of this is pain and pleasure are polarized, but then you also have polarities like light and dark, warm and cold. Any qualities like that have this polarization quality to them, or polarization structure to them, and it's through this polarization or polarity that we have something like a unity of the living being. So the functions of integration and differentiation are unified through this polarization of affectivity. This polar structure of affectivity. Actually, it might be helpful here to bring in some ideas that he sets out in some of his lecture courses that have been published, where he gives maybe more concrete depictions of what he's talking about here in sort of abstract terms. So he talks about tropism as being sort of the fundamental form of perception, or what perception is fundamentally built on. Tropism is the capacity of living beings to orient themselves in relation to a gradient in the environment in some way. So certain bacteria, for example, will orient themselves towards a gradient of sugar in their environment. So they swim up towards the higher concentrations of sugar because that's what they feed on. And then you have phototropic organisms like a sunflower. Yes, exactly. Sunflowers orient themselves towards the sun. So they respond to a gradient of light in their environment by orienting towards the light. And then there are other organisms that have a negative phototropism, so they orient themselves away from light. They if you pick up a rock in the forest or something, you'll see all these bugs that will run away from the light and try to hide under another rock. So yeah, Simondon argues that this property of tropism is the sort of fundamental activity or structure of what is later built up into perception in animals. But it's a sort of fundamental property of living beings in general that then undergoes elaboration and development into perception. So something along the same lines is what he's thinking of here, I think. So tropism is always relative to a polarity of qualities. So it's always, because it's oriented towards some sort of gradient in the world, it has to be relative to the more and the less of whatever quality is being oriented towards. So light versus dark, or more sugar versus less sugar, or whatever it is. It's in that sense that there's something like this qualification that he described here. I think we can read tropism as the equivalent of qualification, or as at least being an aspect of that qualification. And then so he points out that this we can see this concretely in the reflex arc in animals, so that there's some sort of stimulus which elicits a reflexive response, and this reflex arc, or this circuit of stimulus and response, can be understood in terms of a quality. So you can understand it as there's a pain response, a pain sensation or quality, and then the reflex action of say moving the organ that is in pain to remove it from the stimulus. So there's this qualitative aspect to the reflex arc. This same polarization is realized in a more complex sense in human perception and affectivity, and so he argues, or he states here, that personality is also characterized by these same types of polarities. The same structure of polarization is present both in the low level reflex responses of animals, and also in high level structures like personality, so that it's the same fundamental structure that's realized in both cases. The next bit is again pretty obscure. So he says here, when a subject wants to express its internal states, what it resorts to is the relation through the intermediary of affectivity, which is the principle of art and all communication. So that bit seems okay. So there's because there's this shared structure of affectivity, it allows for something like an expression of an internal state, which can't be sort of referred to directly, but we can elicit the same state in another person or another being through because they have the same affective structure. So that seems okay. But then, yeah, so it's in order to characterize an exterior thing that cannot be shown, it seems weird that it's an exterior thing that cannot be shown rather than an interior thing. But yeah, that's what it says in the French too, an exterior thing. So I'm not sure why these exterior things can't be shown in particular. Yeah, so in order to characterize an exterior thing that cannot be shown, it is through affectivity that we can pass from the continuous totality of knowledge to the singular unity of the object to be evoked. And this is possible because affectivity is present and available to institute the relation. So I think this is again just pointing towards the way that we can bring about a state in an individual, in another person, because they have the same affective structure as we do. So we can sort of point them in the same direction along that polarization axis. But I don't know what this bit on the continuous totality of knowledge, passing from the continuous totality of knowledge to the singular unity of the object to be evoked. I don't really know what that's supposed to be about. And then he says each association of ideas passes through this affective relation. Again, I'm not really sure what that means here. I mean, I think at one level we can just say that association of ideas is not something like a purely intellectual process where you sort of pass from one idea to one that's related in some sort of intellectual way. But there's this affective element to the relation between one idea and the next one. But sort of more precisely, I'm not sure exactly what is going on there. And then this bit especially is obscure. So thus there are two possible types of utilization of relation already constituted by going from the unity of knowledge to the plurality of action, or from the multiplicity of action to the unity of knowledge. Yeah, so what these two forms of two possible types of utilization of that relation are supposed to be, or what they're doing here, is not clear to me. There's some sort of passage from a unity of knowledge to the plurality of action, and again from the multiplicity of action to the unity of knowledge, and those two passages, or those two utilizations, are supposed to be affective in nature, but beyond that, I don't know what exactly is going on here. The next bit, and he talks about poetry based on this idea of these two complementary paths, but I'm really not sure what exactly it means when he talks about symbolism here. So in some sense, symbolism is supposed to rejoin the two paths, the path from unity of knowledge to plurality of action, and the path from multiplicity of action to unity of knowledge. Somehow symbolism in poetry is supposed to unify those two paths, and then that makes it possible for poetry to become self-enclosed in aesthetic recurrence. So sort of closed off and sort of forming its own world, I guess. But again, I don't really know exactly what that's supposed to mean. I sort of promised when we were reading the bit on quantum physics that this part would be easier to read, but I think that turned out not to be true. This part is at least as obscure as the part on quantum physics so far. I had forgotten this bit, but yeah, I think it does become easier to follow after this first part. And then this bit is clearer. The next paragraph, where he talks about the different regions of the brain. So there are some portions of the brain that can be mapped onto regions of the body in terms of reception So there's the inverted homunculus in the brain. If you sort of if you like map the human body onto the brain, it's sort of like a upside down person, sort of with, of course, distorted in terms of the size of the different regions. Like the face and the hands are huge compared to other parts of the body. Different motor responses in there's also, so in addition to these to the frontal lobes, which and I think Simon uses this term somewhere in this section, right? The receptor and motor area. So the idea was that receptor areas and then passing directly to the motor areas. Instead, you have the signal goes into this association area, which does something to it, and then passes a signal to the motor area, possibly, not necessarily, so that it's not some sort of direct hardwired connection from the receptor area to the motor area that is operating, but there's some sort of intellectual operation or cognitive operation is happening in these association areas, and so he's these three sort of regions of the brain he's sort of identifying with the three functions that he's set out. So the receptor area would correspond to integration, and the motor area would correspond to differentiation, and then the frontal lobes would correspond to the transductive activity. And then he points out that in lobotomy, lobotomy acts on the frontal lobes, but at the same time, like the effect of lobotomy has an effect on the affectivity of the person. So a person that undergoes lobotomy has this change in their affective states and in their personality. And so this, Simondon argues, this shows that there's affectivity can't be regarded as something that is sort of a purely primitive function or condition that would be localized in the pituitary stalk. Instead, we have to think of affectivity as having this relational aspect. There's something like a relational affectivity, which brings about the relation between the integrative and the differentiative activities. So there's some sort of affectivity which comes about in the frontal lobes and not just in the pituitary. So again, this depends on some specifics of brain science, which has obviously undergone a huge development since Simondon was writing. And I'm not super familiar with the details of whether what Simondon was arguing here holds up. I guess 60, 70 years later. I think some of the argument about affectivity can be sort of maintained regardless of the specifics of the brain localization stuff that he's talking about here. Whether or not that holds up today, I think is sort of it doesn't necessarily determine the validity of the rest of his argument. So maybe we have time for one more paragraph. It's a long one. So maybe one page or so, and then we'll see how far we get in the discussion. If someone else would like to read.
I guess I'll just read about a page. We would also understand in this sense that affectivity is the sole function, due to its relational aspect, capable of giving a meaning to negativity. The nothingness of action and the nothingness of knowledge are indiscernible without a positive context in which to intervene as a limitation or a pure lack. Whereas for affectivity, nothingness can be defined as the contrary of another quality. As Plato noted, every realized quantity appears to be inserted according to a measurement into an indefinite dyad of contrary and absolute qualities. Qualities become pairings of opposites, and this bipolarity of each qualitative relation is constituted as an ongoing possibility of orientation for the qualified and qualifying being. Nothingness has a meaning in affectivity because two dynamisms confront one another at each instant. The relation of integration to differentiation is constituted as the bipolar conflict in which forces are exchanged and reach equilibrium. The being conserves its identity due to its orientation with respect to itself and to this effective polarization of every content and every psychical constituent. Identity seems to be founded on the permanence of this orientation in the course of existence, an orientation which is deployed due to the qualification of action and knowledge. Certain very profound intuitions of the pre-Socratic philosophers reveal how a qualitative dynamism exchanges actions and structures in existence, either with a being or from one being to another. Heraclitus and Empedocles in particular defined a relation of the structure and of the operation which supposes a bipolarity of the real according to a multitude of complementary paths. Affectivity realizes a type of relation which would be conflict in terms of action and incompatibility in terms of knowledge. This relation can only exist on a level of affectivity, since its bipolarity allows it to unify the heterogeneous. Quality is transducted by nature, for each qualitative spectrum links with and distinguishes terms that are neither identical with nor foreign to one another. The subject's identity is precisely a transductive type of identity, particularly across the first of all transductivities, that of time, which can furthermore be fragmented as much as desired into instants or grasped as a continuity. Each instant is separated from those that can follow or precede it through time by precisely what unites these instants and constitutes its continuity relative to them. Distinction and continuity, separation and relation are the two complementary aspects of the same type of reality.
So yeah, this is one of these sort of stream of consciousness paragraphs where he starts with one thing and then just has like a chain of associations that leads to something completely different, just in a long sequence of semicolons. He starts off talking about the way that affectivity is the only function that can give meaning to negativity as such. So in the case of action and knowledge, there's negativity is only comprehensible in contrast to something positive. So there you can have a positive context in which there's something like a limitation or a lack of action or knowledge. Whereas in the case of affectivity, you have this polarization or this polar structure, so that the negative actually has a quality, a contrary quality to the positive. Darkness is not just experienced as a lack of light, but it has its own positive quality. And same thing with hot and cold and so on. And so he connects this with Plato's doctrine of the indefinite dyad. And then I posted in the chat here, there's a translation mistake. So it says every realized quantity in the translation, but it should say every realized quality, which is what the French says. So we're not dealing with quantities here, we're dealing with qualities. Yeah, so there's this indefinite dyad, this opposition between the two sides of the polarity. And so because of this, there's something like a meaning of nothingness, or nothingness has its own quality. It's able to appear in this relation, and then there's this bit on the relation between integration and differentiation, which appears as this bipolar conflict. So this opposition between integration and differentiation has this same polar structure. And then he passes to this this idea that an entity conserves its identity by its orientation with respect to itself and the affective polarization that constitutes it. So it's what makes up the identity of a living being is not some sort of substantial reality, but rather the polarization that makes it up. There's this permanence or this maintenance of this orientation with respect to this polarization that is maintained across the lifespan or the existence of this living being. And then there's this bit on the pre-Socratics, which again I'm not sure what in particular he's pointing to in Heraclitus and Empedocles, but maybe the doctrine of the way that the elements sort of cycle through each other. So in Empedocles, you have the four elements, and then they have the associated qualities. So fire is hot and dry. Or wait, yeah, is it dry? I forget exactly how it works out, but there are these qualities that are associated with each of the elements. So that each element is sort of the bearer of these qualities, and they have this polar structure, this opposition structure. And yeah, Heraclitus does have some sort of idea of conflict being the sort of general principle of a being, so that beings are made up of some sort of conflicting qualities or conflicting forces. Yeah, I think Simondon was right to characterize these as intuitions, because they're not, especially with Heraclitus, who was known as Heraclitus the Obscure. It's not sort of worked out into a developed doctrine, at least in the fragments that we have available to us now. Yeah, I'm just looking at the time and the rest of the paragraph we have left here. Maybe we should come back to this paragraph next time, and continue the discussion with that paragraph, just because I think it would take another 5-10 minutes to get through the material in this paragraph. Okay, so let's end here for today. Yeah, there's a lot to sort of go over and try to puzzle out in today's reading. So I think I'm going to have to reread this and try to see what sense we can make of some of the obscurities for next time. But yeah, so thanks everyone for showing up and for your contributions, and see you all next week.